So in today's video, we are going to be discussing which pass rushers should the Chiefs draft this year. Now, before we get into the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and let's jump right into the video. Now, I think it's a universal consensus that the Chiefs' biggest needs this draft is a defensive line and mainly a pass rusher. It was the Chiefs' biggest liability last year, with Chris Jones leading the way with only 9 sacks. The next closest, Frank Clark, at 4.5 sacks. It's pretty obvious that this pass rush was not particularly well last year. It ranked 29th in the NFL in sacks and only had 31 total as a team. When Chris Jones is doing all he can, I think we need to get this man as much help as we can, because it felt like at times last year that this pass rush was just MIA. It was missing for parts of the season. And then I think it really showed that the Chiefs needed a pass rush when you look at the AFC Championship game against the Cincinnati Bengals. I think that really showed that this defensive line needs a massive upgrade. It only sacked Joe Burrow once. And I know it's the NFL. Things change week to week. Like maybe the scheming of the Bengals offensive line against the Chiefs just somehow happened to favor the Cincinnati Bengals. I get it. The NFL, it comes down to matchup. Sometimes it's not exactly how you think it's going to be. But there was literally one of, if not the worst offensive lines in all of football, and the Chiefs were only able to get 1 sack on him. And when the Chiefs were getting home on Joe Burrow, they weren't able to bring him down either. So it wasn't. So even when they were doing great things defensively, they weren't really particularly doing things to finish the play, which can get really frustrating because Joe Burrow was making some special plays in the AFC Championship game. And then it led to more issues. You look at throughout the season, the secondary really struggled because you can't expect our secondary, as much as I don't think the Chiefs need to upgrade and need to worry about the secondary as much as they do about a wide receiver or a pass rusher. It led to major issues in our secondary. We were asking our secondary to do things that were so unrealistic, and it just was not fair. And I get it. Spags scheming sometimes wasn't favorable to our secondary, but it just, in general, the pass rush led to so many issues with the secondary. Like, we all remember Tyrann Mathieu throwing his hands up at Daniel Sorensen. Again, Sorensen was he struggled for most of the season, but come on, some of those plays weren't Sorensen's fault. Like, you can't ask a guy like Sorensen to stay in coverage for as long as the Chiefs were asking him to do. And as we all know, a defensive line is a secondary's best friend. So with the Chiefs having 2 first-round picks this year, owning the 29th and the 30th pick, there were many things that they can do. I mentioned in the wide receiver video that the Chiefs cannot trade away both first-round picks to move up in the draft. And while that still stands for an edge rusher, a pass rusher, I could get behind it a little bit more if it was a pass rusher. Now, am I going to be celebrating that the Chiefs gave away 2 first-round picks to move up in the draft to take an elite pass rusher? No, because at the end of the day, I think the 2 first, especially with the depth of the pass rushers that they have and the wide receivers, I don't necessarily think the Chiefs need to give up both first-round picks. Yes, it's a dire situation, I feel like, on the defensive line, but at the same time, I don't think giving up both first-round picks, even for a defensive lineman, is a good way to go. Even though I would be more, if the Chiefs are going to give up both first-round picks to move up, I would be okay for a defensive line way more than I would a wide receiver. So if we look at the prospects that the Chiefs more than likely will not get, you have Aiden Hutchinson, who is the consensus best defensive player in this year's draft. You have Kayvon Thibodeau. Unlikely that they'll get him. Now, they could trade up to get him because there are people talking that his draft stock seems to be falling, and so that might be a guy that Brett Veach might try to move up and try to get. And then you also have Travon Walker, who has really done himself well leading into the draft. Now, would I love Travon Walker? Yes, but do I think the Chiefs can get him? I feel like that's a huge burden. I think that's a lot that the Chiefs will have to give up to try to get him. But there are 4 prospects that I am looking at. This is mainly for the first round that I think the Chiefs really should try to go after and really should try to get in this year's draft. These are the 4 prospects that I really liked, going through some highlights, reading about them, and these are the 4 guys that I really like. The first guy we have is Jermaine Johnson II out of Florida State. Now, he has great size. He's 6 foot 5 inches, 262 pounds. And if we look at his 2021 stats, he had 70 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, 12 sacks, and 18 tackles for loss. He is a great play disruptor. He's a very physical guy. He can dominate an offensive line, and he uses his hands very, very well to get leverage on the offensive linemen. And he has great speed. He ran a 4.58 40, and he has a great jump off the ball. Now, the biggest downside with Jermaine Johnson is that he only played 1 full season as an edge rusher, so that might scare teams away that he still has a little bit more development to go at that position. But from what I saw and everything that Jermaine Johnson can do, I think he's a great guy that the Chiefs should try to get. Then we have David Ojabo out of Michigan. Now, this guy probably would have been drafted really high if it wasn't for his injury at his pro day where he tore his Achilles, because I feel so bad for him. I think he is one of the best players in this year's draft defensively, and I think when it comes to pass rusher, it is absolutely loaded. Now, the injury might hurt his draft stock, and he might be able to fall to the Chiefs. That injury does worry me, but he does have a lot of talent. I think it might be a huge gamble, and it's not his fault. That injury is just unfortunate. It would be a huge risk. It may not work out for them, but if he can fall, the potential for David Ojabo is so freaking high. You look at his stats in 2021, 35 tackles, 5 forced fumbles, 11 sacks, 12 tackles for a loss. He has great speed himself too, 4.55 40 speed, and he's explosive off the ball, great acceleration. He's a great tackler, which it feels like sometimes we're complaining a lot as Chiefs fans that the Chiefs just refuse to tackle. He can play bully ball with the offensive lineman, and he has the speed to beat the offensive lineman. He can push them around, gain leverage, do great things to make some plays. But the one knock that people seem to have on him is he played with Aiden Hutchinson. Now, I understand that knock a little bit, but at the same time, those two guys played with each other, so maybe they were able to learn off of each other, and maybe David Ojabo can bring things that he learned from Aiden Hutchinson over to the pros and develop and become a very good player. Then we have possibly my favorite prospect that the Chiefs should go after, and that's Boye Mafe. I probably butchered that name, but he's out of Minnesota, and this is the guy that Chiefs fans are talking about probably the most. In 2021, he had 34 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, and 1 forced fumble. Now, these numbers aren't particularly flashy, but if you watch some of his highlights of what this guy can do, this guy's potential is through the freaking roof. I think he's so athletic, and I think this guy can become a stud and become a complete playmaker in the NFL. He's very explosive. He has great speed off the ball. He can run down ball carriers like no other, and he's very physical. And again, he is my favorite prospect in this year's draft. So if the Chiefs, if he does end up falling into that 29th or 30th spot, I can fully see the Chiefs taking this guy in this year's draft. And the final guy that I have here is a guy that nobody's talking about, which is weird because he's also listed one of the top prospects in a lot of people's minds, and that's George Karlaftis. Like, he's a guy that he's ranked really, really high, but nobody seems to be talking about him. He is out of Purdue, and he has great speed. And then if you look at his stats in 2021, he had 41 tackles, 3 forced fumbles, 5 sacks, and 6.5 tackles for loss. Now, his numbers weren't particularly well, because if you look at his stats, that he has fallen off every single year. His best season was actually 2 years ago, so that might hinder some NFL teams, and that might drop his status a little bit, because they're like, well, this guy had really high potential and he kind of fell off. But at the same time, if you spin that into a positive way, you kind of spin zone this, you also realize that the guy has shown that he can be an elite level player. And I think if you just look at his highlights, he's a very, very good player. He has great speed, he's explosive, he's a playmaker, and he can, again, he's another guy that I think can just beat offensive linemen with ease. It seems like he can do it in a very effortless way. So I think he's a very good prospect, and another guy that if he for some reason falls, I really do think that this is a guy that the Chiefs should try to take a chance on and try to get him in this year's draft if he is still available. But those are the 4 guys that I think the Chiefs should try to get in this year's draft. Who do you think the Chiefs should draft as their pass rusher for the future? Leave me comments down below and I will read them, and I'll see you in the next one.